The silent warning we all ignore. Have you ever felt exhausted in a way that sleep cannot fix? A kind of fatigue that lingers, quiet, unshakable, almost nameless. You close your eyes at night, but when you wake up, nothing has changed. The weight is still there. The heaviness still clings to your soul. Maybe you've tried everything. More sleep. Less work. A vacation. Meditation. A change of scenery. And yet, deep down, something still feels off. It's as if a part of you has shut down. Stalled. Stuck in a cycle you can't seem to break. But what if this exhaustion isn't just physical? What if this weariness, this deep, quiet ache inside of you, is actually a message? A warning. A call. A divine whisper breaking through the noise of your life. Because sometimes, when we refuse to listen, when we push forward without direction, without purpose, without rest, God has to get our attention another way. And He often does it through the one thing we can't ignore, our own bodies. The unseen battle inside you. We live in a world that glorifies movement. Productivity. Hustle. The next goal. The next achievement. The next task. Keep going, they say. Push through. You're just tired. Get more coffee. Sleep when you're dead. But what if you're not just tired? What if this exhaustion is your soul protesting? What if your body is shutting down because your spirit is carrying a weight it was never meant to bear? You see, in the Bible, exhaustion was never just a physical state. It was often a spiritual signal. Elijah, after calling down fire from heaven, collapsed under a tree and begged God to take his life. 1 Kings, chapter 19, verse 4. Jonah, running from his calling, fell into a deep, unnatural sleep while a storm raged around him. Jonah, chapter 1, verse 5. Even Jesus, in his human form, withdrew to desolate places to rest, not just his body, but his soul. Luke, chapter 5, verse 16. Yet we ignore the signs. We press on, convincing ourselves that exhaustion is just a part of life. That the weight on our shoulders is normal. But what if it isn't? What if this fatigue you feel is not a burden to push through, but a doorway to something greater? The moment of realization, because exhaustion, when ignored, does not go away. It deepens. It spreads. It takes root. And one day, you wake up and realize, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. The passion you once had? Gone. The fire inside you? Extinguished. Your prayers? Empty words. This is not just burnout. This is not just being tired. This is your soul crying out. And the question is, will you listen? Because whether you realize it or not, God has been speaking to you. Not through thunder. Not through lightning. Not through a burning bush. But through the silence. Through the weight in your chest. Through the quiet sighs when no one is watching. Through the moments you catch yourself thinking, I can't keep doing this. And maybe, just maybe, He is calling you to stop. To stop running. To stop striving. To stop carrying a load you were never meant to bear. And instead, to turn back. To Him. To the only one who can take that crushing weight off your shoulders. To the only one who ever said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. The real question is, will you keep ignoring the signs? Or will you listen, before it's too late? When God speaks through exhaustion, we treat it like an inconvenience. A problem to solve. A weakness to overcome. But what if exhaustion isn't just a symptom of a busy life? What if it's something far deeper, something divine? What if God, in His infinite wisdom, allows us to reach the end of our strength, because it's the only way we'll finally turn to His? Throughout the Bible, time and time again, exhaustion was never just about being tired. It was a turning point. A moment when God was speaking, loudly, but the only way he could get someone to listen was by bringing them to their knees. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what he's doing with you. Elijah, when victory leaves you empty, imagine this: you have just seen the power of God like never before. You've stood before an entire nation, called down fire from heaven, and watched the impossible happen. You should feel alive, victorious, unstoppable. But instead, you feel empty. That was Elijah. After one of the greatest miracles in the Bible, the showdown on Mount Carmel where God revealed his power, Elijah wasn't celebrating. He wasn't rejoicing. He was running for his life. And then, finally, he collapsed under a tree and begged God to take him. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life." 1 Kings, chapter 19, verse 4. How does a man go from calling fire down from heaven to wanting to die? Because exhaustion isn't just about what happens on the outside. It's about what happens inside. And Elijah had reached his breaking point. But here's what's beautiful: God didn't rebuke him. God didn't call him weak. God didn't tell him to get over it. Instead, God sent an angel. "Get up and eat," the angel said, "for the journey is too much for you." 1 Kings, chapter 19, verse 7. God knew Elijah's exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. And he met him there. Not with thunder. Not with judgment. But with rest. And maybe, that's what he's offering you too. Jonah, when running leaves you broken, some exhaustion doesn't come from working too hard. Some exhaustion comes from running from what God has called you to do. Jonah knew this feeling well. When God called him to preach to the city of Nineveh, Jonah didn't just say no. He ran. He boarded a ship, set sail in the opposite direction, and tried to drown out God's voice. But here's the thing: you can run from God, but you can't outrun him. The storm came. The sea raged. And Jonah was thrown into the depths. And there, in the belly of a great fish, Jonah broke. No more running. No more resisting. No more pretending he could handle life on his own. "When my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord," Jonah prayed. "And my prayer came to you." Jonah, chapter 2, verse 7. Jonah was exhausted, not just from the storm, but from the weight of disobedience. And maybe that's what's happening to you. Maybe the exhaustion you feel isn't because you're doing too much. Maybe it's because you're resisting what God has actually called you to do. And God, in His mercy, is letting you feel the weight of that, so you wake up before it's too late. Jesus, when even the Son of God needed to withdraw, and then, there's Jesus. The only one who never sinned. The only one who never strayed. The only one who was in perfect alignment with God's will. And yet, even Jesus grew weary. Not just from the demands of his ministry. Not just from the crowds pressing in on him. But from carrying the weight of the world. And when it became too much, he withdrew. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Luke, chapter 5, verse 16. If the Son of God needed to step away to find strength, what makes us think we can keep pushing through without doing the same? We act as if exhaustion is a problem to fix. Jesus treated it as a signal, a reminder that his strength came from the Father alone. And maybe that's what we've forgotten. The message in your exhaustion: Elijah, Jonah, Jesus. 3 different stories. 3 different reasons for exhaustion. Elijah was exhausted because he had given everything, but felt like he had nothing left. Jonah was exhausted because he was running from the very thing God told him to do. Jesus, though perfect, felt exhaustion because he carried the burdens of a broken world, and he knew he needed to stay connected to the Father. And now, here you are. What if your exhaustion is trying to tell you something? What if, instead of ignoring it, distracting yourself, numbing yourself, pushing yourself harder, you actually listen? What if God is speaking through your weariness? Not to punish you, not to burden you, but to rescue you. Because when you finally stop running, when you finally let go, that's when He steps in. And that's where the healing begins. The lies we tell ourselves about strength. We live in a culture that worships productivity. We measure success by how much we accomplish, how little we rest, how hard we push ourselves. You have to hustle. You have to grind. Sleep is for the weak. We glorify exhaustion as if it's a badge of honor. And yet, more people than ever feel empty, disconnected, and completely drained. Because the world has lied to us about what strength really is. And if we're not careful, we'll believe those lies until we collapse under them. The strength that destroys you. Some exhaustion is normal. A long day at work. A difficult season. The weight of responsibilities. But there's another kind of exhaustion, one that no amount of sleep can fix. This is the exhaustion that comes from striving without direction. From carrying burdens you were never meant to bear. From moving so fast that you never stop to ask, God, is this even where you want me to go? This is what the Sovereign Lord says: in repentance and rest is your salvation, in quietness and trust is your strength. But you would have none of it. Isaiah, chapter 30, verse 15. Did you catch that? God doesn't say strength comes from pushing harder. He says strength comes from rest. From surrender. From trusting Him instead of relying on yourself. But we don't listen. We fight rest. We resist stillness. We convince ourselves that if we just do more, we'll finally feel enough. And so, we keep running. Ignoring the signs. Ignoring the heaviness in our chest. Ignoring the deep, quiet whisper telling us, this isn't working. The warning signs we ignore. God didn't create you to live burned out. He didn't design you to constantly be exhausted. But when we refuse to stop, when we keep pushing forward in our own strength, He lets us feel the weight of it. Not to punish us. Not to hurt us. But to wake us up. And if you're paying attention, the signs are everywhere. You feel disconnected, even from the things you once loved. You feel burdened, not just physically, but deep in your soul. You feel lost, like you're doing everything you're supposed to, but none of it brings peace. You feel numb, like you're going through the motions, but you're not really living anymore. Sound familiar? Then maybe, this isn't just exhaustion. Maybe this is God trying to get your attention. Because true strength, the kind that doesn't destroy you, doesn't come from doing more. It comes from being still. The truth about strength. Somewhere along the way, we believed the lie that stopping is weakness. That rest is laziness. That if we don't keep moving, keep striving, keep producing, everything will fall apart. But here's what's terrifying: sometimes, we refuse to stop until God forces us to. He closes doors. He removes distractions. He lets us reach the end of ourselves so we finally see the truth. That real strength is not found in independence. It's found in dependence on Him. That real peace is not found in achievements. It's found in His presence. That real rest is not found in vacations, distractions, or quick fixes. It's found in surrender. And until we learn that, we will keep running ourselves into the ground. The crossroad you're standing at. Maybe you're at that breaking point right now. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're drained. Maybe you don't know how much longer you can do this. So hear this: you don't have to. You don't have to carry all of this alone. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to keep pushing until you collapse. God never asked you to live that way. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. The question is, will you listen? Or will you keep believing the lie, until it breaks you? The weight of carrying what God never asked you to. Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, nothing is working? You push. You strive. You do everything you're supposed to do, and yet, you feel stuck. Doors close. Opportunities slip through your fingers. The exhaustion gets heavier. And instead of stopping to ask, God, is this really what you want for me? You keep pushing forward. Because quitting feels like failure. Because slowing down feels like weakness. Because somewhere along the way, you believe the lie that if you're not constantly doing something, you're wasting your life. But what if the real reason you feel so drained is because you're carrying a weight God never asked you to carry? The road that leads to destruction. There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end, it leads to death. Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 12. It's easy to assume that as long as we're moving forward, we must be on the right path. That if we work hard enough, push through the obstacles, and never give up, we'll get to where we're supposed to be. But what if the road you're on, the one you've poured everything into, is not actually God's path for you? What if all these closed doors, all this frustration, all this exhaustion, isn't the enemy stopping you? What if it's God Himself? Because sometimes, the greatest act of mercy God can show you, is blocking you from a path that leads to destruction. Just ask Balaam. Balaam, when God blocks the road. Balaam was a man who thought he knew what he was doing. He had a plan. He had a goal. He had his own agenda. So when an opportunity came that didn't align with God's will, Balaam didn't stop to ask, Lord, is this your plan? He just started moving. But God saw where that road would lead. So He sent an angel to stand in Balaam's way. Balaam didn't see it. He kept pushing forward, forcing his way down a road God had already closed. But then, his donkey stopped. It refused to move. It pressed against the wall. It collapsed under him. And Balaam, blinded by his own determination, got angry. Why won't you move? He yelled. Why are you making this so difficult? And then, God opened his eyes. Suddenly, Balaam saw the angel. I have come to stop you, the angel said, because the road you are on is leading to destruction. Numbers, chapter 22, verse 32. Can you imagine? Fighting, struggling, forcing something to happen, only to realize that God Himself was blocking your way out of mercy? How many times do we do the same thing? We keep pushing forward. We keep ignoring the signs. We keep forcing doors open, doors God already shut to protect us. And then we wonder, why am I so exhausted? Why does everything feel so heavy? Why does it seem like no matter how hard I try, nothing is working? Maybe it's not because you're not strong enough. Maybe it's not because you're not trying hard enough. Maybe it's because God never asked you to carry this in the first place. How we ignore the signs until we collapse. We like to think we'd recognize when God is trying to stop us. But the truth is, most of us don't. Instead, we mistake His closed doors for failure. We mistake His roadblocks for obstacles we need to overcome. We mistake His silence for abandonment, when in reality, it's an invitation to surrender. But we don't want to surrender. So we keep moving. Even when the weight is unbearable. Even when we feel it draining the life out of us. Even when everything inside of us is screaming, this isn't right. And eventually, we collapse. Not because God failed us. Not because we weren't strong enough. But because we ignored every single warning He gave us. The mercy of letting go. So here's the question, what if, instead of fighting against God, you surrendered to Him? What if you stopped pushing for something that isn't meant for you? What if you laid down the weight of carrying something God never asked you to carry? Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. Rest isn't found in forcing things to happen. Rest is found in trusting that if God is blocking something, He has a reason. Maybe the relationship that fell apart was God protecting you. Maybe the job you didn't get was God redirecting you. Maybe the dream that didn't come true was God making room for something better. The exhaustion you feel, the frustration, the heaviness in your soul, it's not a punishment. It's a rescue. So stop. Breathe. Let go. Because God is not asking you to carry this anymore. Spiritual fatigue. When the soul grows weary, not all exhaustion comes from physical labor. Not all weariness comes from sleepless nights or endless responsibilities. There is a different kind of exhaustion. A deeper kind. A fatigue that no amount of rest can fix. A heaviness that lingers, no matter how much you try to distract yourself. It's the kind of exhaustion that comes from within. And if you've ever felt it, you know, this is not just being tired. This is your soul, breaking. David's silent suffering. David knew this kind of exhaustion well. He wasn't just a king. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a man who carried deep, hidden burdens. And at one point, those burdens became so heavy that they didn't just weigh on his heart. They began to affect his body. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. Psalm, chapter 32, verse 3. Did you catch that? David wasn't physically sick. He wasn't suffering from an illness. But his soul was so burdened, so exhausted, that it was manifesting in his bones. Because that's what happens when we carry things we were never meant to carry. The weight of guilt. The weight of shame. The weight of unspoken sins and unresolved struggles. At first, we think we can handle it. We bury it. We ignore it. We move on. But over time, the weight grows. And one day, we wake up and realize, we are completely, utterly drained. Not just in our bodies. Not just in our minds. But in our very souls. The burdens no one sees. We like to pretend we're fine. We smile. We go to work. We show up for our families. But deep inside, there's a heaviness. A burden we carry in secret. For some, it's guilt, the weight of past mistakes. For others, it's shame, the fear that if people knew the truth, they would walk away. For many, it's regret, the haunting question, what if I had done things differently? And so we do what David did. We keep silent. We push it down. We pretend it's not there. We convince ourselves, I'll deal with this later. But the burden doesn't go away. It lingers. It drains us. It takes its toll. Until one day, we wake up and realize, we have nothing left to give. We are spiritually exhausted. And we don't even know how to fix it. How the body reacts when the soul is in turmoil. We like to separate the physical from the spiritual. But the truth is, they are deeply connected. Just like David felt the weight of his silence in his bones, we too feel the effects of spiritual fatigue in our bodies. That heaviness in your chest. It's not just stress. That constant exhaustion. It's not just lack of sleep. That tension in your shoulders. It's not just bad posture. When your soul is weary, your body reacts. You feel sluggish. You feel weak. You feel like no matter how much rest you get, it's never enough. Because the problem isn't physical. The problem is spiritual. The only way to heal. David tried to carry his burden alone. But eventually, he couldn't do it anymore. And so, he did the one thing that finally brought relief. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. And you forgave the guilt of my sin. Psalm, chapter 32, verse 5. David didn't find peace by trying harder. He didn't find relief by distracting himself. He found healing the moment he stopped running, and started confessing. The moment he let go of the weight, and allowed God to carry it instead. And maybe, that's what you need to do too. Maybe the exhaustion you feel isn't just life being hard. Maybe it's your soul begging you to stop pretending. To stop hiding. To stop carrying burdens that only God can carry. Because the truth is, you were never meant to bear this weight alone. The invitation, if you're tired, truly tired, there is only one way forward. Not another self-help plan. Not another escape. Not another distraction. Just this: come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. That's it. That's the answer. That's the way out. Not striving. Not pretending. Not keeping silent. But surrender. So the real question is: will you keep carrying this weight? Or will you finally lay it down, before it breaks you? The breaking point, when exhaustion becomes a prison. At first, you don't even notice it. The fatigue. The heaviness. The slow, creeping exhaustion that settles into your bones. You tell yourself it's just a rough season. That you need more sleep. That things will get better soon. But the days turn into weeks. The weeks turn into months. And before you know it, you're running on empty. Not just physically. Not just emotionally. But spiritually. And the most terrifying part? You don't even care anymore. The silent warning signs before burnout. Burnout doesn't happen overnight. It starts with little things. A loss of joy. A heaviness you can't explain. A numbness that spreads little by little. At first, you think you're just tired. Then, you start noticing the deeper symptoms. You stop praying, not because you're angry at God, but because you just don't have the energy. You feel disconnected from the people around you, even the ones you love. You go through the motions, doing what needs to be done, but you're not really there. The things that once inspired you, the things that once set your soul on fire, now feel pointless. And then, one day, you wake up and realize, you don't feel anything at all. How ignoring God's voice can lead to spiritual numbness. God doesn't just speak through miracles. He speaks through whispers. Through quiet warnings. Through the slow, gentle nudges that tell you something is off. But when we don't listen, when we keep pushing, when we keep ignoring the signs, when we convince ourselves that we can handle it on our own, the warnings start to fade. Not because God has stopped speaking, but because we've stopped listening. And that's when the real danger begins. Because spiritual exhaustion isn't just tiring. It's paralyzing. It drains your strength. It dulls your passion. It makes you feel disconnected, from God, from others, from yourself. And worst of all, it makes you believe the lie that this is just how life is. That the fire you once had is never coming back. That the joy you once knew is gone forever. That this feeling, this emptiness, is your new reality. But that's not true. Because God never designed you to live this way. The moment of realization, something has to change. There comes a point. A moment when the weight becomes too much to carry. When the numbness becomes too unbearable to ignore. When something inside of you finally breaks, and you whisper the words that change everything: God, I can't do this anymore. Maybe you're at that moment right now. Maybe you've tried everything. Maybe you've fought as hard as you could. Maybe you're exhausted in a way that words can't describe. And you don't know what to do next. But listen to me, there is only one way out. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. Not another self-help method. Not another temporary escape. Not another way to push through. Just Him. Just Jesus. Because when you finally stop running, when you finally surrender, that's when healing begins. That's when the numbness lifts. That's when the prison door swings open. And for the first time in a long time, you can finally breathe again. The divine pause, when God stops you for your own good. You had a plan, a vision, a clear direction for where your life was supposed to go. But then, everything stopped. Doors that once seemed wide open suddenly slammed shut. Opportunities slipped through your fingers. No matter how hard you pushed forward, nothing worked. And now, you feel stuck. Trapped in a season of waiting, unsure of what's next. And the frustration is unbearable. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. But what if this pause isn't a mistake? What if the delays, the failures, the roadblocks, are not the enemy? What if they are God Himself, stopping you? Not to hurt you. Not to punish you. But to protect you. When God uses exhaustion as a warning, we assume exhaustion is always a problem to solve. But sometimes, exhaustion is a divine intervention. A stop sign from heaven. Because God sees what we cannot see. He knows when the path ahead will destroy us. He knows when our striving is leading us further from Him. He knows when we are chasing something that will never satisfy. So, sometimes, He stops us before we reach the point of no return. And sometimes, He does it by allowing us to feel so tired, so drained, so exhausted, that we have no choice but to stop. Not because He wants to break us, but because He knows if we keep going, we will break ourselves. What if the closed door is God's mercy? Think about the last time something didn't go your way. A job you didn't get. A relationship that fell apart. A dream that never came to life. At the time, it felt like failure. But what if, years from now, you look back and realize that closed door saved you? What if the thing you were begging God for would have led to heartbreak? What if the opportunity you chased would have pulled you away from your calling? What if the life you planned for yourself was so much smaller than what God had planned for you? We see the delay. We see the disappointment. But God sees the full picture. And sometimes, His greatest act of love is not giving us what we think we want. It's stopping us before we wreck our lives. The Israelites, when waiting is part of the journey, the Israelites had one job. Leave Egypt. Enter the promised land. The journey should have taken days. But instead, it took 40 years. Not because God wasn't leading them. Not because He had forgotten them. But because they weren't ready. Their hearts were still enslaved to fear. Their faith was still weak. They wanted the destination, but they weren't prepared for what the destination required. So, God let them wait. Not to punish them, but to prepare them. Because there are some lessons that can only be learned in the pause. Some transformations that can only happen in the wilderness. And some seasons that are not about moving forward, but about who you are becoming while you wait. The purpose in your waiting, maybe that's where you are right now. Wandering. Waiting. Frustrated that life isn't moving the way you thought it would. And you're asking, God, why? Why won't you let me move forward? But maybe, that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, God, what are you trying to teach me in this pause? Because what feels like delay, may actually be divine preparation. What feels like stagnation, may actually be spiritual protection. And what feels like God holding you back, may actually be God setting you up for something greater. So don't despise the waiting. Because when God presses pause, it's always for your good. The biblical path to true rest and renewal. You are exhausted. Not just tired, not just overworked, exhausted in a way that sleep cannot fix. The weight of life is crushing you. The pressure to keep going is suffocating. No matter how much you do, it's never enough. And deep down, you wonder, is this what life is supposed to be? But then, in the midst of all the striving, all the stress, all the overwhelming exhaustion, a voice cuts through the noise. A voice that has been calling you all along. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. Not more pressure. Not more demands. Not another list of things to fix yourself. Just rest. A rest that doesn't come from escaping. A rest that doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. A rest that only comes from Him. Why stopping is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. The world tells you to keep going. To hustle. To grind. To push through, even when everything in you is breaking. But God tells you to stop. To let go. To lay it down. To stop trying to carry something you were never meant to carry. And that takes more courage than anything else. Because stopping means surrender. Stopping means admitting that you don't have it all together. Stopping means trusting that God is stronger than your striving. And that is terrifying. Because if you stop, what happens next? If you stop, will everything fall apart? If you stop, will you lose everything you've worked so hard for? But here's the truth, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Psalm, chapter 127, verse 1. If what you're building is not from Him, if the life you're chasing is not His plan, then no amount of striving will ever make it right. And all the exhaustion in the world will not be enough to fix what was never meant to be yours. How God restores what exhaustion has stolen. Exhaustion steals things from you. It steals your joy. It steals your passion. It steals the fire that once burned inside of you. But God is in the business of restoration. I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten. Joel, chapter 2, verse 25. The years you lost to stress, He can restore. The joy that faded under the weight of burnout, He can restore. The faith that felt distant, the purpose that seemed lost, the fire that once fueled you, He can restore it all. But you have to surrender first. You have to trust Him enough to let go of control. To stop chasing things He never called you to chase. To come back to Him, not with perfection, not with performance, but with honesty. With the simple, desperate whisper, God, I can't do this anymore. I need you. And when you do, when you finally lay it all down, that's where true renewal begins. Not in more effort. Not in more striving. Not in trying to fix yourself. But in letting Him heal what exhaustion has stolen. So, what will you choose? Will you keep running yourself into the ground? Or will you finally stop, turn around, and come back to the only one who can truly give you rest?